Were medieval women nothing more than silent subservient figures? Did they truly have no understanding of their own desires, their own bodies, their own power in a world centuries removed from our own, say in the year 1250? Number 8, that medieval women were totally repressed and lacked sexual agency. The very idea of a medieval woman, for many, conjures images of a demure lady locked away in a tower, perhaps embroidering, waiting for a knight. Her thoughts, her desires, her very being, so the common story goes, were entirely dictated by the men around her. And she was a possession moved from her father's house to her husband's, with no say in her own life, especially when it came to something as personal as sex. But look closer, and the tapestry of medieval life reveals threads of surprising agency of women making choices, some subtle, some bold, even in matters of intimacy and partnership. Consider the role of the dowry, a significant sum of money or property that a woman brought into her marriage. While it sounds like a transaction, it often provided a woman with a certain degree of leverage. This dowry, in many regions, remained her property, or at least under her control, even after marriage. A husband could not simply squander it without consequences. This financial independence, however limited, gave women a voice in their marital affairs. They could, for instance, use the threat of taking their dowry and leaving to exert influence over their husband's behavior. Legal documents from the period, like charters and court records from places such as England or France, often show women actively managing these assets, sometimes even independently of their husbands, especially if they were widows or powerful noblewomen. Beyond the practicalities of property, there was the realm of romantic literature, which often presented a more complex picture of female desire and initiation. While courtly love, with its idealized adoration of a noble lady, is often seen as a passive role for women, many narratives reveal women as the instigators of romantic connection. In the lays of Marie de France, for example, a prominent 12th century poet, heroines often take the lead in seeking out lovers or challenging the constraints of their marriages. They are not simply objects of affection, but active participants in the emotional and physical drama of love. Their decisions, sometimes rebellious, sometimes driven by intense longing, shape the course of the stories. This literature, popular among the aristocratic classes, suggests a cultural imagination that recognized, and perhaps even celebrated, female initiative in matters of the heart. Then there are the marriage customs themselves. While arranged marriages were common, especially among the nobility, the concept of consent was surprisingly present in medieval canon law, the law of the church. For a marriage to be valid, both parties had to give their consent, freely and explicitly. While this consent could be coerced in practice, especially for younger women, there are numerous instances recorded in church courts where women petitioned for annulments, arguing that their consent was not freely given. These cases, documented in ecclesiastical court records from places like York or Canterbury, demonstrate that women knew their rights and sometimes possessed the courage to challenge forced unions. A woman who stated, "I do not wish this man," could, in theory, stop a marriage from happening, and sometimes she did. Even in the grittier aspects of society, female agency could be observed. Prostitution, while morally condemned by the church, was a widely recognized and often regulated profession in many medieval towns. Women who chose this path or were driven to it by economic necessity were making a choice, albeit a difficult one, about how they would live and earn. They were not merely victims, but individuals navigating a complex economic and social landscape. The city ordinances from places like Paris or London reveal attempts to manage and control brothels, suggesting a system that acknowledged the presence and, to some extent, the agency of the women who worked within them. These women, in their own way, controlled their bodies and their livelihoods in a manner that might seem surprising from a modern perspective of total repression. They might not have been celebrated, but they were certainly not invisible, nor were their choices entirely absent. The existence of love magic and spells further underscores a belief in women's desire and their ability to influence romantic outcomes. Medieval charm books and magical treatises found in collections across Europe contain numerous spells for women to attract lovers, to secure a husband, or even to bind a man's affection. While these practices might seem superstitious today, they represent an active attempt by women to shape their romantic and sexual lives, to exert a form of control over fate and the hearts of men. They reveal a hope, a yearning, and a proactive engagement with the forces of attraction, a far cry from passive resignation. These texts, studied by historians of magic and folklore, suggest that women were not simply waiting for things to happen to them, but actively seeking ways to make things happen. Number 7, that medieval women had no knowledge about sex or their own bodies. The popular image often suggests that medieval women were entirely ignorant about their own anatomy, their menstrual cycles, or the mechanics of sex. This assumption paints them as innocent, almost childlike, in matters of the body, relying solely on male physicians or old wives' tales without any true understanding. Yet, surviving texts, practical medical practices, and the very nature of community life tell a different story. Medieval women possessed a remarkable amount of practical knowledge about their bodies and the processes of reproduction, knowledge often passed down through generations. One of the most significant pieces of evidence challenging this assumption comes from medical texts written specifically for women. The Trotula, a collection of 3 11th century texts from Salerno, Italy, is perhaps the most famous example. While the exact authorship is debated, some parts attributed to a woman named Trotula, others compiled by male authors, these texts unequivocally focus on women's health, gynecology, obstetrics, and even cosmetics. They discuss menstrual regulation, conception, infertility, childbirth, and postpartum care. They detail the female anatomy, not always with perfect accuracy by modern standards, but with a clear intent to understand and describe the female reproductive system. The Trotula recommends various herbal remedies for ailments, gives advice on managing pregnancy, and even describes procedures for assisting in difficult births. The existence of such a detailed manual, widely copied and disseminated throughout Europe, means that literate women, or those advised by literate practitioners, had access to a significant body of medical knowledge about their own bodies. Beyond formal medical treatises, knowledge was disseminated through the vital role of midwives. But midwifery was an exclusively female profession, passed down from woman to woman, often within families or close communities. These women were the primary healthcare providers for all matters relating to childbirth, but their knowledge extended far beyond that. They understood the signs of pregnancy, labor, and potential complications. They knew about postpartum care, infant feeding, and even some aspects of contraception or abortion using herbal remedies, though often dangerous and ineffective. The practical experience accumulated by generations of midwives meant that vast amounts of knowledge about female bodies, fertility, and reproduction were held and shared by women within their communities. Court records occasionally show midwives being called upon as expert witnesses in cases involving pregnancy or paternity, further highlighting their recognized expertise. Oral traditions and folklore also played a crucial role, as women gathered for communal activities like washing, cooking, and spinning, providing natural opportunities for the exchange of information. Older women would share their experiences and knowledge with younger women, passing down advice on menstruation, courtship, marital relations, and childbirth. Stories, proverbs, and songs often contained embedded knowledge about the body and its functions. While not scientific in the modern sense, this oral tradition provided a practical, lived understanding of female sexuality and reproduction that was accessible to all women, regardless of literacy. Furthermore, medical texts, including those written by men, often discussed female sexual pleasure as a necessary component for conception, mirroring ancient Greek medical theories. For instance, texts sometimes stated that both male and female seed were needed for conception, and that the female seed was released through orgasm. This idea, while medically inaccurate, meant that the female orgasm was not ignored or dismissed, but actively discussed in medical discourse. Physicians and learned individuals whose works would have been available to those with access to books were actively engaging with the concept of female sexual experience, suggesting a broader cultural awareness beyond mere procreation. Even within religious contexts, female bodies and sexuality were subjects of detailed discussion. Confession manuals, used by priests to guide penitents, contained extensive sections on sexual sins. These manuals often described various sexual acts and their perceived moral implications. While designed for moral guidance, they inadvertently provided a detailed, if judgmental, catalog of sexual behaviors and desires. Women going to confession would have been confronted with questions about their sexual lives, and in turn would have reflected on their own actions and experiences, thereby increasing their self-awareness about their sexuality. These manuals, though prescriptive, reveal a keen awareness of the diverse sexual practices and experiences of both men and women in medieval society, including female desires. Number 6, that sex was only for procreation and never for pleasure. It is a common belief that medieval attitudes towards sex were solely focused on reproduction, with any hint of pleasure, especially for women, considered sinful or irrelevant. The strong influence of the Church, with its emphasis on sin and salvation, certainly contributed to this perspective, but the reality was far more nuanced and complex. While procreation was indeed seen as the primary purpose of marital sex, medieval society, its literature, and even some religious and medical texts acknowledged the existence and even the importance of sexual pleasure for both men and women. Consider the genre of medieval love poetry and songs. While much of it focused on courtly love, which was often idealized and non-physical, there was also a significant body of secular, often bawdy, literature that celebrated earthly pleasures, including sexual ones. There are lyrics found in wandering minstrel repertoires, or collected in songbooks, often depicted lively encounters, teasing flirtations, and explicit descriptions of physical intimacy. These verses, popular among various social classes, clearly indicate that pleasure was not just a side effect, but an intended and often sought-after aspect of sexual relationships. These poems and songs, recorded in manuscripts across Europe, showcase a robust cultural enjoyment of sensuality and desire. Medical treatises of the period, as previously touched upon, also discuss female pleasure, often linking it directly to conception. The idea, inherited from classical antiquity and refined through Arabic medicine, was that both male and female seed, or humors, were necessary for successful conception. For the female seed to be released, orgasm was thought to be required. This medical theory, while scientifically inaccurate, meant that female pleasure was not just tolerated but seen as functionally necessary for the continuation of the human race. Physicians, in their advice on how to conceive, might even implicitly or explicitly encourage couples to ensure the woman experienced pleasure. These medical discussions, found in Latin manuscripts across universities and monastic libraries, demonstrate that the biological reality of female pleasure was acknowledged, even if its ultimate purpose was framed in reproductive terms. Even within the strictures of religious doctrine, some surprising concessions to pleasure can be found. While the Church condemned non-procreative sex, and certainly any sex outside of marriage, certain theologians and confessors acknowledged that pleasure was an inherent part of the marital act. They often distinguished between seeking pleasure for its own sake, which was sinful, and experiencing pleasure as a natural accompaniment to procreative marital sex, which was permissible. For instance, some penitential manuals designed to guide confessors would outline various sins related to marital sex, but the very discussion often implied that pleasure was a present, if potentially problematic, element. These intricate theological discussions, preserved in numerous monastic and university texts, reveal a sophisticated understanding of human sexuality that went beyond a simple binary of procreation only. The daily lives of ordinary people, as glimpsed through court records and legal disputes, further suggest that pleasure was a known and sought-after part of sexual life. Cases of adultery, fornication, and even divorce often reveal the complex motivations behind sexual relationships, which were not always about producing heirs. People formed connections based on affection, desire, and companionship. The very existence of illicit affairs, frequently prosecuted but undeniably common, points to individuals seeking gratification and emotional connection outside the bounds of strictly procreative marriage. These narratives, found in ecclesiastical and secular court documents, paint a picture of human beings driven by a full range of desires, not just the biological imperative to reproduce. Moreover, the literature of advice on marriage, though often didactic, sometimes included practical guidance for ensuring marital harmony, which could implicitly involve physical satisfaction. While not explicitly condoning pleasure for its own sake, the very idea of a successful marriage often included the idea of a sexually satisfying union. These texts, aimed at noble and bourgeois families, illustrate that beyond just producing children, there was an understanding that intimacy and contentment played a role in keeping a marriage stable and happy. These documents, found in various European archives, suggest a more holistic view of marriage than often assumed, where physical closeness, even if not solely for pleasure, contributed to the overall well-being of the relationship. Number 5, that all medieval women were chaste and pure, especially virgins. The idealized image of the medieval woman often places her on a pedestal of purity and chastity, a vision perhaps most strongly associated with the Virgin Mary. This assumption suggests that any sexual activity outside of procreative marital relations was unthinkable, and that female virginity was universally preserved until marriage, if not for life within a convent. However, a closer look at the historical record reveals a far more complex and often contradictory reality. In medieval society, while certainly valuing chastity in principle, grappled with the widespread reality of premarital sex, prostitution, and illegitimate births, demonstrating that the ideal of purity was not always the lived experience. The ecclesiastical court records, which handled cases of fornication and adultery, are a rich source of information challenging this assumption. These records from places like England, France, and Germany show a continuous stream of prosecutions against individuals, both men and women, for engaging in sexual acts outside of marriage. The sheer volume of these cases indicates that premarital sex was far from rare. While these acts were considered sinful and could result in penance or fines, the very fact that they happened so frequently means that many women were not, in fact, chaste until marriage. The records detail relationships sometimes long-standing that produced children out of wedlock, demonstrating a reality where sex happened and children were born without the blessing of the marriage sacrament. The prevalence of prostitution, as mentioned before, further undermines the notion of universal female chastity. Prostitution was not a hidden or marginal phenomenon, but an integral part of many medieval urban landscapes. Towns often had designated areas for brothels, and some even owned and regulated them, sometimes even taxing them. While morally condemned, the existence of a visible and often semi-legalized sex trade means that a significant number of women were engaging in non-marital sexual activity as a profession. These women, whether by choice or necessity, were a stark counterpoint to the ideal of the chaste maiden, illustrating a significant portion of the female population whose lives did not align with the purity ideal. Some city ordinances and legal records provide ample evidence of this widespread practice. And illegitimate births were also a common feature of medieval society. While frowned upon, children born outside of marriage were a recognized demographic. Parish records, census data, and legal documents often make distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate offspring, indicating that the latter were a common occurrence. The mothers of these children were, by definition, not chaste in the traditional sense. While some of these births might have resulted from rape, many were the product of consensual relationships that simply did not lead to marriage. The discussions in legal and social texts about the rights of illegitimate children and how to support them further confirm their widespread presence. Furthermore, medieval literature, even beyond the overtly bawdy, often portrays women who are not perfectly chaste. Figures, like Chaucer's wife of Bath, a much married and sexually experienced woman, challenge the prevailing ideal, presenting a robust and unashamed female sexuality. While a fictional character, she reflects a societal awareness that women were not always pure and that their desires and experiences were diverse. Other narratives, from fabliaux to romances, frequently feature illicit affairs, seductions, and women who actively pursue their sexual desires, demonstrating that the idea of female sexual agency, sometimes outside of the bounds of chastity, was present in the cultural imagination. These literary examples, popular and widely circulated, suggest that society recognized a range of female sexual behaviors, not just the idealized pure type. Even within convents, spaces often seen as bastions of purity, the reality could be more complex. While nuns were sworn to chastity, human nature being what it is, not all adhered strictly to their vows. Historical records occasionally reveal instances of nuns breaking their vows of chastity, sometimes leading to scandals or disciplinary actions. These isolated cases, documented in ecclesiastical investigations or monastic chronicles, remind us that even in environments designed to enforce purity, the full spectrum of human desires and actions could emerge. The ideal of universal female chastity, therefore, was exactly that, an ideal, constantly challenged by the messy, vibrant reality of medieval life. Number 4, that medieval women were passive recipients of male desire. The traditional narrative frequently casts medieval women as entirely passive in sexual matters, merely objects of male desire with no initiative or preferences of their own. This assumption portrays them as having no voice, no agency, and certainly no active role in the dance of courtship or the intimacies of the bedchamber. Yet, examining medieval legal documents, literature, and social customs reveals a very different picture, one where women could and did exert significant influence, sometimes even taking the lead, in their romantic and sexual lives. Consider the phenomenon of raptus in medieval law. While often translated as rape today, the medieval term was broader, encompassing not just sexual assault but also abduction, often for the purpose of forced marriage. The fact that medieval laws distinguished between sexual assault and abduction, and that women were often the complainants in these cases, indicates that women had a legal mechanism to challenge unwanted advances or forced unions. Records from secular and ecclesiastical courts show women testifying, bringing charges, and seeking justice for violations against their bodies or their wishes. Their voices, though perhaps mediated by legal frameworks, were heard and acted upon, demonstrating a legal recognition of their right to bodily autonomy. These legal processes, recorded in court rolls and plea books, illustrate that women were not always passive in the face of unwanted sexual attention. In the realm of literature, the idea of the femme fatale, or the active seductress, though often portrayed negatively, was a recurring motif. Figures like Morgan Le Fay in Arthurian legend, or various characters in fabliaux, actively pursue their desires, sometimes manipulating or seducing men to achieve their aims. While these characters might be moralized against, their very existence in popular stories demonstrates a cultural awareness of women who were not just waiting to be chosen, but were choosing, and often initiating, sexual encounters. These narratives, circulated widely in manuscript form, show that the medieval imagination could conceive of women as powerful agents in the realm of desire. Furthermore, the practice of elopement, while sometimes a desperate act, also points to female agency. If a woman was being forced into an unwanted marriage, or if she wished to marry a man against her parents' wishes, eloping was a drastic but sometimes effective solution. While often risky and fraught with social consequences, the act of eloping required active participation and consent from the woman. Such actions, documented in legal disputes over inheritance or marital validity, demonstrate women making conscious choices to circumvent societal expectations and pursue their own romantic and sexual paths. These instances, recorded in court documents and family histories, reveal women defying norms and taking control of their unions. Even within marriage, a woman's control over her dowry and dower rights, a portion of her husband's property she would receive upon his death, provided her with a degree of leverage. A husband who mistreated his wife or failed to provide for her could face legal action or social censure, sometimes initiated or supported by the wife's family, or by the wife herself if she was brave enough. Women could petition for separation or annulment through ecclesiastical courts, citing grounds such as impotence, consanguinity, or lack of consent. These legal avenues, while difficult to navigate, demonstrate that women were not entirely without recourse in unhappy or abusive marriages and could take active steps to change their situation, including challenging their sexual circumstances. The existence of these legal battles, documented in court records, underscores female efforts to control their marital and physical lives. Finally, the sheer variety of roles women played in medieval society, from powerful queens and abbesses to independent merchants and artisans, indicates that women were far from universally submissive. Women ran households, managed estates, engaged in trade, and contributed significantly to the economic life of their communities. This broader social and economic agency often translated into personal agency. A woman who managed a bustling tavern might also be a woman who had a say in her own romantic and sexual life, whether within or outside of marriage. Their lives, documented in charters, guild records, and household accounts, reveal a diversity of roles and levels of influence, which would naturally extend to personal matters of desire and intimacy, making them far from passive recipients in any aspect of their existence. Number 3, that homosexuality did not exist for medieval women or was completely ignored. The assumption often persists that female homosexuality was either non-existent in the medieval period, or, if it did exist, was utterly ignored, unspoken, and therefore unacknowledged by society or the church. The focus on procreation within marriage and the condemnation of non-procreative sexual acts often leads people to believe that same-sex desire, particularly for women, was inconceivable or simply erased from the historical record. However, while overt discussions are rarer than for male homosexuality due to different social structures and forms of evidence, there are tantalizing clues and direct references that indicate that female homoeroticism was recognized, discussed, and sometimes condemned, proving its existence. The most prominent, though often indirect, evidence comes from penitential manuals and theological treatises. These texts, designed to guide confessors and define sin, occasionally mention and condemn sexual acts between women. For example, some penitentials describe specific sins, such as tribadism or friction, between women, detailing the perceived gravity of these acts and prescribing penances. The very act of naming and condemning such behaviors, even if rarely, confirms that they were known to exist and were a concern for the church. These mentions, while judgmental, are invaluable because they break the silence and indicate that female same-sex relationships were not entirely invisible to religious authorities. These theological texts, found in libraries across Europe, provide a window into the recognition of these practices. Within the cloistered environment of convents, where women lived together in close community, the potential for intense emotional and perhaps physical bonds between women was recognized. While monastic rules enforced strict celibacy, some monastic writers and reformers expressed concerns about particular friendships that could develop between nuns, sometimes implying a sexual dimension. For instance, the works of figures like Elred of Rivalx, a 12th century Cistercian abbot, discuss different forms of love and friendship within monastic communities, sometimes cautioning against attachments that could become too intimate or exclusive, hinting at potential transgressions among women. While these writings are not explicit condemnations of lesbianism, they suggest an awareness of intense female bonds that might cross perceived boundaries. These concerns, articulated in monastic rulebooks and spiritual guides, imply the presence of such relationships. Literary and artistic representations, though subtle, also offer glimpses. While less common than depictions of male same-sex desire, some medieval texts or illuminations contain ambiguous or suggestive imagery that has been interpreted by modern scholars as hinting at female homoerotic relationships. The intensely emotional language used in some spiritual writings by women mystics, while primarily directed towards God or Christ, can sometimes be read as reflecting a deep capacity for passionate connection, which might have manifested in human relationships as well. Although difficult to definitively prove, these interpretations suggest that the emotional and physical spectrum of female relationships was not entirely absent from cultural expression. Furthermore, medieval legal codes and city statutes, while mostly silent on female sexual acts compared to male acts, sometimes implicitly or explicitly mention specific punishments for women engaging in such behaviors. These legal references, though scarce, confirm that these acts were not unknown to secular authorities and were deemed worthy of legal consideration. For example, some court documents or municipal regulations, in their detailed lists of forbidden sexual acts, occasionally included references to acts between women. These legal condemnations, though rare, nevertheless serve as historical markers of the existence of female homoeroticism in medieval society. The broader social context also plays a role. In a world where women's lives were largely separate from men's in many spheres, in households, guilds, and communal activities, intense female friendships and bonds were natural and common. It is reasonable to surmise that within these close-knit female worlds, romantic and sexual relationships between women would occasionally blossom, even if largely unrecorded or actively suppressed by a male-dominated society and church that often focused on male-female relations for social and procreative reasons. The very silence in some historical records, contrasted with the occasional explicit mention, suggests that female homoeroticism was perhaps more often ignored or underreported rather than genuinely non-existent. The limited but crucial evidence clearly indicates that female same-sex desire was a recognized, if often condemned, aspect of medieval life, challenging the notion of its complete absence or societal obliviousness. Number 2, that sexual violence against women was ignored or accepted. It is a pervasive and disturbing assumption that sexual violence against women in the medieval period was simply an accepted part of life, that women had no recourse and that their assaults were overlooked or dismissed by law and society. This view often stems from a misconception of medieval justice as entirely brutal and uncaring towards women. However, historical evidence from legal codes, court records, and literary sources demonstrates that medieval society did recognize rape as a serious crime, that victims often pursued justice, and that perpetrators could face severe penalties, indicating that sexual violence was neither universally ignored nor passively accepted. Medieval law codes, both secular and ecclesiastical, unequivocally condemned rape. The very existence of specific statutes and penalties for raptus rape or abduction in legal texts from various European regions like England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire proves that it was a recognized criminal offense. These laws were often quite harsh, with punishments ranging from heavy fines and imprisonment to mutilation or even death, particularly if the victim was a virgin or a noblewoman. The severity of these penalties, outlined in legal treatises and royal decrees, indicates that authorities viewed rape as a profound transgression against the individual and social order, not merely a minor offense. Crucially, medieval court records show that women did bring charges of rape and sought justice. While the legal process could be daunting and challenging for victims, especially those without social standing or family support, there are numerous documented cases where women appeared in court, presented their testimony, and pursued their accusers. These records, from local manorial courts to royal assizes, reveal the bravery and determination of women to hold their assailants accountable. Their narratives, though filtered through legal scribes, reflect a desire for justice and an expectation that the legal system would, at least in theory, protect them. The very act of taking a perpetrator to court, even if conviction was not guaranteed, demonstrates that victims were not entirely powerless and that the crime was not ignored. The concept of a woman's honor was profoundly tied to her sexual reputation, and an assault was considered a grave dishonor not just to the woman but to her family. The societal value, while placing a burden on women, also meant that families often had a strong incentive to pursue legal action against rapists to restore the honor of their kin. Feuds and violent reprisals could also occur if legal justice was not perceived to be forthcoming, further demonstrating that rape was not something to be taken lightly by the community. Chronicles and legal records often contain accounts of such disputes arising from sexual violence, highlighting the seriousness with which it was viewed within social dynamics. Religious teachings also played a significant role in condemning sexual violence. The Church, through its canon law and moral theology, explicitly forbade rape. Confession manuals outlined it as a grave sin, requiring penance and restitution. The sanctity of the individual and the emphasis on consent, even if often violated in practice, formed a theological basis for condemning forced sexual acts. And preachers often condemned sexual violence from the pulpit, reinforcing the moral opprobrium attached to such crimes. These religious condemnations, recorded in theological works and sermons, indicate a widespread moral rejection of rape. Finally, medieval literature, while sometimes reflecting the harsh realities of violence, also contained narratives where rape was portrayed as a horrific act, and the perpetrators were often punished or condemned. Romances and ballads, for instance, frequently featured heroines who were victims of violence, but these narratives often centered on their struggle for justice or revenge, rather than presenting their suffering as inconsequential. These stories, read and enjoyed by a broad audience, show that the idea of sexual violence was not glorified, but was understood as a crime, often inspiring outrage and a desire for retribution, demonstrating a cultural understanding that such acts were profoundly wrong and deserving of punishment. The evidence across legal, social, and religious spheres firmly indicates that sexual violence against women was a recognized, condemned, and often prosecuted offense in medieval society. Number 1, that medieval women had no control over their fertility. The prevailing assumption is that medieval women were entirely at the mercy of their biology when it came to conception, with no knowledge or means to control their fertility. This view often envisions a constant state of pregnancy or childbearing, with women passively accepting whatever number of children nature dictated. However, while modern contraception did not exist, medieval women employed a variety of methods, both traditional and empirical, to manage their fertility. These practices, though often ineffective or dangerous by today's standards, demonstrate a conscious effort to space births, prevent unwanted pregnancies, or even terminate them, revealing a surprising degree of agency over their reproductive lives. One of the most common and widely documented forms of birth spacing was prolonged breastfeeding. It was well understood, through empirical observation, that a nursing mother was less likely to conceive. Women often breastfed their children for 2 to 3 years, or even longer, which naturally extended the period between pregnancies. This practice, driven by both child health and fertility management, was a conscious choice and a significant factor in birth spacing, widely practiced across social classes. Evidence of this practice can be found in advice manuals for mothers, medical texts, and even infant feeding practices recorded in household accounts. Abstinence, particularly periodic abstinence within marriage, was another method of fertility control. While not for pleasure, couples might practice abstinence for religious reasons, such as during Lent or other penitential seasons. Some also followed popular beliefs about avoiding conception during certain phases of the moon or at specific times in a woman's menstrual cycle, even if their understanding of ovulation was limited. While not always effective, these conscious decisions to abstain for periods of time demonstrate an intent to limit family size or prevent conception, indicating a degree of control over their reproductive choices. Confession manuals, which often discuss sexual practices, sometimes indirectly refer to such forms of temporary abstinence within marriage. Herbal remedies were also extensively used for both contraception and abortion. While the efficacy and safety of these concoctions are highly questionable by modern medical standards, medieval women and female practitioners like midwives possessed a vast knowledge of plants and their perceived medicinal properties. Herbals and medical texts of the period list various plants believed to prevent conception contraceptives or induce miscarriage abortifacients. These included plants like pennyroyal, savin, rue, and mugwort. Women would gather or purchase these herbs and prepare them for consumption, seeking to control their reproductive outcomes. The very existence of such remedies, and their widespread use, as documented in medical manuscripts and folklore collections, confirms women's active attempts to manage their fertility, even if the results were often unpredictable and risky. The practice of coitus interruptus, or withdrawal, while not discussed explicitly in many formal texts, is likely to have been known and practiced. As a simple and accessible method of birth control, it would have been a natural discovery for sexually active individuals. While it does not appear as a formal recommendation, its implicit presence as a possible practice, as suggested by the general human capacity for innovation in such matters, points to another avenue through which couples might have attempted to control conception. Furthermore, medieval legal systems, particularly in cases of infanticide or exposure of infants, reveal the tragic consequences of unwanted pregnancies. While infanticide was a serious crime and severely punished, the fact that such cases appear in legal records, however rarely, indicates that women sometimes resorted to desperate measures to prevent or deal with unwanted births. These cases, documented in criminal court records, are grim reminders that women faced immense pressures regarding fertility and sometimes made desperate choices to exert control over their reproductive lives, even when faced with extreme circumstances. Finally, the concept of lying in, the period of rest and recovery for a woman after childbirth, also contributed to birth spacing. It was a time when sexual activity was often curtailed, contributing to the natural interval between pregnancies. This practice, often supported by cultural norms and community expectations, provided a socially accepted period of abstinence, further demonstrating that women's bodies and their reproductive cycles were managed through a combination of traditional wisdom, herbal knowledge, and social customs, allowing for a degree of control over their fertility that is often underestimated. The existence of these diverse practices, from breastfeeding to herbal remedies, shows that medieval women were not passive vessels but active agents in managing their reproductive lives.